So here's the thing, because we're doing a video on YouTube about a product whose name is very close to a descriptive word, we need to butcher the name of that product into a descriptive word to interpret how we feel about the product. So here goes. The Fractal Terra is terribly close to being a bad case. And that's actually controversial going by thumbnails and titles of videos about this product already on YouTube, but if legendary is a descriptive word for this case, then Lord knows what that video says about the thing. I mean, it's not terrible, it's just not that good either. Let's get into it. So here's my front-running thoughts in the front of my mind regarding the Fractal Design Terra. It's expensive, it's kind of lacking cooling options, and it's not quite as well designed as it may appear. That's a lot of negative there, but there are some positives too. It's really pretty, it's small, and it's really accessible for maintenance. Let's run through that super quick with the normal stuff, and then we'll talk about the performance. So first up, it's expensive, really expensive. It's around $180 or £180 or 200 euros. That's a small graphics card or decent CPU or a really good drive's worth of cash. Case-wise, in the same ballpark, around 11 litres, it's in the firing line of the older Fractal Node 202, Silverstone ML 06B, and nearly everything from Geek, which you can get for less than half the price. But on the other hand, the fancier cases like stuff from Dan Cases and Luke are as expensive, if not more than this. You might think the super popular Cooler Master NR200P is comparable, but it's nearly 50% larger. That's how small this thing is. But anyway, is this worth it? Well, let's see. Next, it's lacking in cooling. So one of the main and interesting features is you can move the spine of the case a little bit here or a little bit there. This gives you a pile of options trading off GPU space for CPU cooler space and vice versa. So you can go for a slim graphics card and a nice taller air cooler like an L9X65, or go for a monster of a card with a smaller L9i or L9A cooler, or maybe even an AIO or a water-cooled system with space for a very small 120mm radiator and fan in the graphics card compartment, which will limit your card size. I'd stick with a fairly large 2-slot card and a decent air cooler on your CPU, but that's just me. Although, one thing I will say, just cutting in there about the spine, is that it is a very interesting feature, but once you've locked that in place, that's kind of set it and forget it. The chances of you going back and changing the position of the spine is very limited, so bear that in mind. So what's with all the whinging about the lack of cooling options? Well, you can't add any more fans that will actually help airflow, I think. Okay, Fractal, if you don't use a power supply in it, you can fit a 120mm fan beneath the power supply in it position. And sure, if your cables look like this, then you might make it work. But with my 100mm long, not very long, Corsair SF600 power supply in it, with all the cables to support the motherboard, CPU, graphics card, at least one drive, and the Molex connector line for anything else you might want, like a fan controller, and this thing is absolutely rammed. Even without the drive and Molex lines, you're going to need to train the living hell out of your cables to make a fan work down there. I also just don't think a fan this out of place is going to do an awful lot. You're really relying on the coolers of your components to wick away all the heat. I'm going to see if I can utilize the larger 10mm standoffs of the power supply unit bracket and adding a fan in the AIO position to encourage airflow through the CPU cooler's compartment will help, and flip it round to see what happens the other way, but we'll see about that later. It is actually quite interesting. As for the it's not quite as well designed as it looks thing, first I'd like to say overall it is well designed. There are screws everywhere, so pretty much every panel is removable, but there are a few areas that I'm not sold on, ignoring the fact that I bought this thing for the review. First is the rear. We have got 3rd generation Tesla panel gaps here. At least these ones were intended. I think the sheer amount of unfiltered space here, the emphasis on unfiltered there, could be exploited for a wind tunnel-esque design with either the lower power supply unit fan position perhaps, or maybe even the central fan position I'm going to be trying later on. But chances are that position is only going to help one side or the other, but not both at the same time. And if we're going to go back quickly to that wind tunnel-esque design thing, I would give them points there for that design, but really I don't think they necessarily well engineered that to be the case, because most wind tunnels have a clear intake and exhaust rather than just shotgun intake from everywhere. Side, top, side, base, rear, all open. Virtually completely open and completely unfiltered. So this isn't so much airflow design as it is airflow shotgun. So there's that. Either way, the rear feels a little unrefined considering how over-designed other areas of the case are. Now you could argue it's silly to complain about the rear because you just won't see it that often. I mean, look at it. You don't see it. But you'll probably see it more often than the power supply unit cable channel. I mean, look at the lump of aluminium used to carve out the rear and front panels. They're 8mm thick panels and heavily machined. It just doesn't quite add up to me. At the thermal approach, it seems to be air's gonna do what air's gonna do. On the unfiltered bit, there aren't any filters on this case at all, so it'll be a dust magnet for sure. Granted, the side panels that open gull wing style, which can be removed with the rear position levers, are excellent. I haven't seen that on a case before. That's really nice, and the top comes off just as swiftly, which is also very good, and will at least make cleaning the dust magnet regularly easier. But alas, no filters to be seen. So that's the main down points, but like I said earlier, it's really pretty. The finish is excellent. The real wood panel to the front is super clean against the aluminium body, and the I/O is very minimal, or uncluttered, or lacking from a different point of view. No power or drive LEDs or audio jacks or reset button, just a USB Type A and Type C, which is alright, and the power button, which is the clicky type, not the satisfying ka-chunk type. It's not a tinny click though, so at least says that. If that's a deciding factor for you, the super high performance Endorphi ARX or ARX 500 that just came out and I just reviewed is worth a view. Unfortunately, there are some more down points to discuss. The drive support seems super phoned in last minute. There are some Velcro straps to the front which hold one drive, and a bracket that you get in the parts box with all the screws, some straps, and while we're on it, the side stuff, there's also a lovely note to give this whole package an artisan feel. Kid you not, this is a case like any other. It's just smaller and costs a lot more than most. Anyway, the bracket. If you don't feel like resting your power supply unit cables on or in a fan, you can rest them on a drive, which seems a lot more sensible. But yeah, both drive positions almost feel like there was a meeting involving the words forgot and good enough. More problems, the fan position for the AIO. Well, it's definitely an AIO position first and foremost. The steel is way too thick to use for fan screws, so for my testing, I ended up just using some twist ties, which were good enough for my purposes. They didn't cause any more noise. I've got those rubber dampers on the fans, but so anyway, so it sort of just about good enough. The base fan position holes are fine though, definitely fan screw holes. Panel gaps aren't as great. One side panel slots in a lot easier than the other, but that will be different between each unit, so your mileage may vary and could be solved in my case with a washer, since the chassis is disassemblable with all the screws. The graphics card bracket is interesting. To get a clean install, you actually remove a bracket that houses one side of the PCI Express riser cable that is included. The other side has a neat plastic bracket to handle the 180-degree turn cleanly into the motherboard. Anyway, with that bracket removed, you can remember to remove the screws prior to slotting the card into the supported riser, and then replace the bracket for the finished article. Why does this case need a bracket for the card to be installed? Does it make the install easier? It's there because you can't access the screws because the rear panel is in the way of them, and my guess is trying to shift the frame and provide enough access around the spine moving screw was a step too far. Could we shift the spine moving screw to the other side to match the front and maybe reduce one of the bending processes during manufacture? Probably, which adds to the I don't think it's as well thought out as the fancy welcome card with concept art sketching leads me to think it is. lines of questioning. So let's get into the performance. Since there aren't any case fans, the initial full speed testing that I do is very simple. Run the system with the CPU and graphics card coolers fans locked as normal, measure the noise and see what temps we get. Normally I'd be getting the stock fans to spin as fast as possible for this testing, but yeah, no included fans. CPU-wise, it's not looking so good. The Terra is right at the bottom of the list. I know it looks strange since it seems cooler than some of the other cases, but the average temperature is worse. If you take the two temperatures from the two different tests, find the middle point between the differences of the two, and all the rest, it is worse. There we go. As for the graphics card, it's looking a little better. I know the lower cases look like they're doing better, but the order of this graph is based on the score, and those lower cases didn't quite complete all of their runs, so they immediately get a nuked score to reflect the actual performance. A crashy system is not a very good system. On average, in this testing, the Terra is not performing well, but at least it's kind of quiet at 36 dBA. So let's move on into adding that fan into the spine of the case to see what happens. To make this more fair, in this testing we're limiting the speed of the case fan so that the total noise output of the system is 37.5 dBA at 40 centimeters, same for all the cases. With the fan pulling air from the CPU compartment into the GPU compartment, or in other words blowing air directly towards the side panel as an exhaust, the GPU is a touch hotter and the CPU is a touch cooler than when the fan is intaking air into the CPU cooler's compartment. This results in a rather poetic balance of thermals, both orientations averaging at 65 degrees minus the room temperature, delta T. Although I haven't marked that on the graph, so that's my bad. So taking the exhaust setup forward to compare to all the other cases, the CPU performance is certainly wanting, as is the GPU performance. All in all, it's bad, and that fan only shaved off about a degree total from the unfanned temperature. I can imagine the intended single fan position would fare about as well, considering it would be blowing air either up the ass of the... But then again, if it was an exhaust blowing down, would it create a wind? I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. I think it would be pulling just as much air from the sides of the case and the top as it would be from the actual rear compartment, as it were. So I'm not convinced it's a good design. Anyway, there are actually fan screw holes below the motherboard section, right underneath the graphics card too, the perfect position. But there's no room for a fan down there at all, and it's not mentioned in the manual where the other base position is. My guess is the holes are there for component symmetry, for the sake of ease of assembly. So anyway, thermal score ends up being very near the bottom at 24%, or 2.4 out of 10 if you want. So let's wrap this up with the final round of graphs. Compatibility score is very middling for the Terra. This is all, by the way, this graph is all relative to the case volume. So just because it's small doesn't mean the score will be bad, even if the case can only take 2 SSDs like the Terra, its main downfall. It also falls down the pack due to the lacking radiator space, and since it doesn't have any fans included in the box, it's 4th from the bottom in the compatibility score, with the bonus graph, fan bonus graph. Build quality wise, it's slightly above average. The panel gaps on reflection really aren't great. The more I look at the top panel, the more it's looking out of place from the rest of the body, but it also has no filters, or it does, they're just really coarse, keeping out the ball bearings and maybe the cat. Installation scoring for the Terra is pretty low. Granted, it's a tiny case, so it's bound to suffer if it's not very well designed. The lack of filter doesn't impact this score, so keep that in mind. But the panel access and motherboard install was perfect for me. However, the power supply unit, drives, and cable management were all low points. I haven't touched on cable management that much, fair. But yeah, you either have to use the fan position below, or you have to impede the graphics card position if you want to put a harness in for one drive, 2.5 inch drive, then that's going to be a bit of fun to store the rest of the harness. You can go custom cables, but then again, a really well-designed case might not have to cope with that, and there is plenty of leftover space, such as underneath the motherboard and graphics card section. There is a big bracket with pile of space underneath there, but it's just not very well accessible. So yeah, not great on the cable management there. This score starts at a 10, by the way, and reduces with each bad aspect of the case in each area. So it gets a 7 out of 10, essentially. So it's not awful, it's just not outstanding. So there we go. All those main categories added up, the Terra is slightly above average on the scoring, and since there's nothing super special about this case that makes it significantly better than the standard scoring covers, it doesn't get any bonus points like the O11 Dynamic Mini did for all the extra rear panels in the box.
AV from the future here, I was a cynical sod about that spine moving thing to give you a bit more variation in GPU size and CPU cooler size, so I'm going to backtrack a second and I'm going to give this an extra 10% bonus points, which would be 1 out of 10, extra 1 out of 10 bonus points for that spine moving thing. Because, yeah, sure, once you set it and forget it, you probably will just forget it. But it does give you options, you know, you can mess around with it. And I think it's just as valid for bonus points as the O11 Dynamic Mini's multiple back plates for your various sizes of motherboards. So there we go. Hopefully that tempers things a bit. And I think it's fair.
Full circle back to the start. Since the Terra costs $180 or roughly equivalent in your region, its price versus score, or high price versus average score, yields a horrendous price, or terrible price versus score performance or result. But yeah, like I said in the Fractal North review, the point of this case, or any cases like this, isn't value, which that graph is all about. How often does something really expensive yield amazing value? Most of the time something far cheaper achieves a similar result. So my advice on this one, big if, you love certain aspects of this case and you can overlook the potential to experience some or most of the downsides that I've outlined. So like cable management, if you're going to do custom cables, then that's not going to bother you. If you're going to throw in an AIO, then maybe that other things might not, but you get the picture. So if you can overlook those downsides that I've outlined and the cost doesn't bother you, then sure, go for it. And make sure you consider using my Amazon associate links in the video description, much appreciated. Otherwise, I think this is a cute case and I need to review a lot more like it. I think there's a better Rev 2 on the way for this thing, and there are a handful of changes that I'd make to reduce cost and increase performance and overall value. I'm fine with the panel alignment minor issue, even though it impacts the look, which is half of the point of this thing, and the general layout is interesting, but there's no real thought to the airflow given the fan positions on offer, and just all the holes. I'm sorry, I'm moaning now. There is no the airflow strategy, it's just see what happens. Thanks to everyone for being so patient for me to make another video. I hope I didn't ruffle too many feathers here. If you like this case, that's fine, and I completely get it. I have liked loved far worse cases than this thing. So, you know, I'd be a hypocrite to say that you're an idiot to want to get this thing. It's cool, but it's not amazing. And it's not legendary. Christ, it's not legendary. Whoever thought it was legendary? Like, anyway, comment down below or join the Discord for any questions or suggestions, and to join all these guys in the credits. Please like the video, and if you found it useful, please subscribe if you want more things like this. And, of course, thank you for checking this one out, and I'll catch you in the next one.